June 28, 1942. Lieutenant Hans Albrecht's pen slipped as the truck hit another crater. He cursed, watching ink spread across the paper like a wound. Around him, 50 men packed into the canvas-covered bed, singing Erica until their throats burned with dust. "Still writing that girl?" Carl Fischer shoved his shoulder, grinning through 3 days of beard growth. "We'll be home before your letter arrives." Hans folded the ruined page into his pocket. "My mother worries." "Your mother should worry about what you'll do when you get back and find out your sweetheart married the baker's son." The men laughed. Someone threw a boot. Carl caught it midair and tossed it back. "What did you tell her this time?" "That we're winning. That the Ivans are running. That I'll be home for Christmas." "All true." Carl pulled out a flask, took a drink, passed it over. "Except the Christmas part. We'll be done by October." The vodka burned. Hans wiped his mouth and looked out through the gap in the canvas. Endless steppe. Endless columns of trucks and tanks stretching to the horizon. Endless dust rising like smoke signals announcing their arrival. Somewhere ahead lay a city called Stalingrad. Nobody in the truck had heard of it before this morning's briefing. "Hey, Albrecht." Private Joseph Schneider, 19 years old and still believing war was an adventure, leaned forward. "Your brother fought in France, right? How long did Paris take?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks for France. Joseph's eyes went distant, calculating. "So how long for one Russian city?" Carl answered before Hans could. 2 weeks, maybe less. "Did you see our panzers? The Ivans have nothing like that. They'll break and run like they always do." But Hans had stopped listening. He was watching Major Wilhelm Hoffmann 3 trucks ahead, standing in the command vehicle with maps spread across a folding table. Even from this distance, Hans could see the major's face, could see something there that didn't match Carl's confidence. Hoffmann kept looking east, kept checking his watch, kept shaking his head at something his radio man was saying. Hans had served under Hoffmann at Kharkov. The major didn't shake his head unless something was wrong. That night, they made camp in a village with no name. The inhabitants had fled or been moved, leaving behind empty houses and a well that still worked. Hans found a corner in what used to be someone's kitchen and tried writing again by candlelight. "Dearest Mother, we advance so quickly the maps can't keep up. The men are in good spirits. Officers say this will be our last campaign before the Bolsheviks surrender. Some talk of Moscow, others of a city on the Volga. Either way, the war in the East is nearly won. Please don't believe the worrying reports. I am well. I am safe. I will come home to you." He paused, pen hovering over paper. What he didn't write: the smell of burning villages, the bodies in ditches, the way Soviet prisoners stared at them with eyes that held no fear, only calculation, as if memorizing faces for later. The feeling that they were driving deeper into something vast and patient and utterly unlike France or Poland. "Albrecht." Hoffmann's voice from the doorway. "Walk with me." They went outside where the night was full of stars and the sound of 200,000 men trying to sleep. Hoffmann lit a cigarette, offered one. Hans took it. "You write home often?" Hoffmann said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." "What do you tell them?" Hans hesitated. "That we're winning, sir." "Are we?" Hoffmann drew smoke, exhaled slowly. "I've been reading the intelligence reports. The Soviets retreat, yes, but in good order, burning everything, taking the rail lines with them. We captured an entire town yesterday and found 3 loaves of bread and a dead dog. That's not panic. That's planning. Sir, we've covered 400 kilometers in a month. Into nothing." Hoffmann flicked ash. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what happens when we reach Stalingrad and they decide to stop retreating?" Hans had no answer. "Write your mother," Hoffmann said. "Tell her you're safe, but maybe don't promise Christmas." They reached the Don River on August 5th. Hans stood on the western bank and looked across at the smoke rising in the distance. That was Stalingrad, 30 kilometers away. Between here and there, nothing but open steppe and whatever the Soviets had waiting. The artillery started 3 days later. Not the massive barrages of France, but careful measured fire feeling out Soviet positions. Hans watched from an observation post as shells impacted in the distance, raising columns of dirt and smoke. Economical, Hoffman muttered beside him, binoculars pressed to his face. Paulus is conserving ammunition. Is that bad, sir? It means he thinks this will take longer than 2 weeks. Hoffman lowered the binoculars. Battalion commanders meeting tonight. I want you there taking notes. The meeting happened in a commandeered farmhouse. 12 officers crowded around a table with a map of Stalingrad spread across it. General Paulus stood at the head, uniform immaculate, despite the heat and dust pointer in hand, like a university professor. Gentlemen, let me be clear. Paulus tapped the map. This is not a city. It's an industrial zone stretched along 30 kilometers of riverbank. 3 main factory complexes, residential districts mixed with defensive positions. The Volga behind them means no retreat. When we attack, they'll have nowhere to go. Timeline General, someone Hans didn't recognize. 2 weeks for preliminary bombardment, 2 weeks for the main assault. By September 15th, Stalingrad will be ours and we'll pivot south to the Caucasus oil fields. And if they reinforce across the Volga? That was Hoffman's voice, carefully neutral. Paulus smiled. Major, our Luftwaffe owns the sky. Any boat on that river is target practice. The 62nd Army is trapped on the western bank with finite supplies and no escape route. Basic mathematics. After the meeting, Hans found Hoffman outside smoking again. The major was staring east where the glow of Stalingrad's lights made a false dawn. You don't believe him, Hans said. I believe the mathematics. What I don't believe is that the Soviets will do the logical thing and surrender. Hoffman ground out his cigarette. Get some sleep, Lieutenant. August 23rd, we begin the air bombardment. After that, everything changes. August 23rd, 4:00 p.m. Hans was eating lunch when the bombers came. Not dozens, hundreds. The sky turned black with Heinkel and Junker aircraft wave after wave flying east toward Stalingrad. The sound was a physical thing, pressing down, making conversation impossible. Karl appeared beside him holding a piece of bread forgotten in his hand. Sweet Jesus! They watched for 2 hours as the bombers made run after run. From 30 kilometers away, they could see the smoke rising black and thick and climbing until it merged with the clouds. When the wind shifted, they smelled it burning wood and oil, and something else nobody wanted to name. Joseph Schneider, who had asked about Paris, stood apart from the others and vomited into the grass. That night, nobody sang. They entered Stalingrad on September 5th. Hans had expected ruins. What he found was something worse. The city wasn't dead. It was dying slowly, fighting every meter of the way. His company drew an assignment to clear a residential block near the tractor factory. Hoffman gathered them in the shell of an apartment building. Through the broken windows, they could see more ruins stretching north and south, smoke rising from fires that had burned for 2 weeks. Listen carefully. Hoffman's voice was flat, professional, empty of the doubt Hans had heard before. Standard clearing procedure doesn't work here. The Soviets hide in basements, in sewers, behind walls. You clear a building, you mark it, you move on. 5 minutes later, they're shooting you from behind. So what do we do, sir? Karl asked. We adapt. Hoffman pulled out a grenade. Every room gets one of these before you enter. Every basement gets cleared twice. You see movement, you shoot first. Questions come later. Stay with your partner. Do not under any circumstances pursue enemies into spaces you haven't cleared. Is that understood? They said yes. They didn't understand. Not yet. The first building took 6 hours. Not because it was heavily defended, but because it was a maze. Rooms led to other rooms, led to collapsed hallways, led to basements that connected to the building next door through holes blown in the foundation. Hans and Karl moved through it like they were underwater. Everything slow and muffled and wrong. In what used to be a child's bedroom, Karl found a doll on the floor. He picked it up without thinking. Hoffman slapped it out of his hand. "Booby trap," Hoffman said. "Check everything. Trust nothing." They found the first Soviet soldier in a third-floor apartment, not hiding, sitting in a chair with a rifle across his lap, waiting. He fired once before Karl's return fire cut him down. The bullet passed so close to Hans's head, he felt the heat. Karl stood over the body hands, shaking. He didn't try to run. He just sat there and waited for us. "Get used to it," Hoffman said. "They're not retreating anymore." By evening, they'd cleared 4 buildings and lost 8 men. Hans sat in a basement writing by flashlight, while above him the city echoed with gunfire and explosions and screams. His letter was 3 lines long. "Mother, we are in Stalingrad. That is all I can say. Please pray for us." He folded it, addressed it, handed it to the company mail clerk, who looked at him with eyes that had aged a decade in one day. "Will it get there?" Hans asked. The clerk shrugged. "If I make it back to send it." September bled into October. Hans stopped counting days and started counting buildings. The residential block took 2 weeks. They advanced 3 streets. The cost was 42 men from his company alone. Hoffman stopped giving casualty reports because nobody wanted to hear them anymore. The fighting developed a rhythm. Dawn brought Soviet artillery. Midday brought German counterattacks. Evening brought house-to-house fighting in the dark. Night brought no rest because the Soviets infiltrated positions under cover of darkness, and you woke up with enemies inside your own perimeter. Hans watched Karl change. They all changed. The joking stopped. The singing stopped. Karl's hands developed a tremor that never went away. He'd stand watch staring at nothing, rifle gripped so tight his knuckles went white. And when Hans spoke to him, it took 3 tries before Karl responded. "I can't sleep," Karl said one night. They were in a factory basement sharing a cigarette between 4 men because tobacco was running low. "Every time I close my eyes I see that apartment, the one on Krasny Prospect." Hans remembered. They'd thrown a grenade into a room, entered to find a Soviet soldier's body. Except he wasn't dead. He'd held his intestines inside with one hand and fired a pistol with the other. Took 2 more shots to finish him. "Try not to think about it," Hans said, knowing how useless that was. He should have been dead. He was dead. But he kept fighting. Karl's voice cracked. "What kind of men are these?" Joseph Schneider had the answer. He'd stopped looking 19. Combat aged you or killed you, and Joseph had chosen aging. He sat cleaning his rifle with mechanical precision, not looking up when he spoke. "They're not men. Can't be. We shot a wounded Ivan 3 times yesterday, and he still tried to crawl toward us with a knife. Major says it's fanaticism. I say it's something else." "What?" Hans asked. "They know something we don't." Joseph looked up then, and Hans saw the fear underneath the exhaustion. "They know they're going to win." Mid-October brought the first frost and a new Soviet tactic. Instead of defending positions, they launched counterattacks. Small groups of soldiers appearing from nowhere, hitting hard, disappearing into the ruins before artillery could respond. The front line became meaningless. You could hold a building at noon and be surrounded by evening. Hoffman called his surviving officers together, 15 men instead of 40. They met in a factory office that still had 3 walls and part of a roof. "Division wants the Barricadi gun factory," Hoffman said without preamble. "That's 400 meters from here. Intelligence says it's lightly defended." Nobody believed intelligence anymore. "When?" Hans asked. "Tomorrow, 0600. Hoffman spread a map across a desk, scarred with shrapnel. 2 companies in the main assault, 1 in reserve. We take it, we hold it. We wait for reinforcements. And if we can't hold it?" Karl's voice was barely a whisper. Hoffman met his eyes. "Then we die there. Those are the orders from General Paulus himself. Not one step back." The attack began in darkness. 300 men advancing through ruins toward a factory complex that looked like something from a nightmare. Twisted metal collapsed roofs, walls with holes you could drive a truck through. And somewhere inside, an unknown number of Soviet soldiers waiting. They were 50 meters from the main gate when the mortars started. Not random fire. Precision strikes that turned their formation into chaos. Hans hit the ground behind a pile of rubble, Karl beside him. Both of them pressed flat, while metal screamed overhead. "Smoke!" Hoffman's voice somewhere to the left. "Lay down smoke!" The smoke grenades went off, white clouds rolling across no man's land. Hans couldn't see 5 meters. Couldn't see Karl. Couldn't see anything except white and the flash of explosions. Forward, Hoffman again. "Move! Move! Move!" Hans ran. Karl ran beside him. Others ran around them. Some fell and didn't get up. The smoke thinned. The factory gate appeared, twisted metal hanging from broken hinges. They poured through it into a courtyard full of wrecked machinery and Soviet soldiers rising from concealment. The next 5 minutes were chaos. Hans fired at movement, reloaded, fired again. Someone screamed. Someone else was calling for a medic. A grenade exploded close enough to shower him with concrete chips. Karl grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a doorway. They made it inside. The factory interior was a cathedral of iron and darkness. Catwalks overhead. Machinery hulking in shadows. Spaces between equipment where anything could hide. Hans's hearing was gone, replaced by a high-pitched ringing. He could see Karl's mouth moving but couldn't hear the words. They cleared the ground floor room by room. Found 3 Soviet bodies. Found 2 of their own wounded. Found a stairway leading up to the 2nd level and stopped because nobody wanted to be first. Hoffman appeared, face black with smoke. He pointed at Hans and Karl and 2 others. "2nd floor. Clear it and set up a position overlooking the courtyard." No discussion, no questions. They went up. The 2nd floor was worse because it had been offices once. Desks and chairs and filing cabinets all thrown together by explosions. A maze with 1,000 hiding spots. Hans led with Karl covering the other 2 men behind. They cleared 6 rooms. The 7th room had the Soviet soldier. He was young, younger than Joseph, sitting behind an overturned desk with a rifle. He saw Hans. Hans saw him. Neither fired. For 3 seconds they just looked at each other, 2 boys in uniforms surrounded by madness. And Hans saw in the Soviets' eyes the same exhaustion, the same fear, the same desperate desire to survive. Then Karl fired. The Soviet fell. The moment ended. Hans didn't remember the rest of the day. They held the 2nd floor. The Soviets counterattacked twice. Both times failed, but cost more men. By evening, Hoffman's company was down to 90 effectives. They'd advanced 400 meters. Division called it a success. That night, Hans sat in the corner of the office they'd cleared and tried to write. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. After an hour, he had 5 words written. "Mother, I want to come home." He crossed them out, started again, crossed it out. Finally, just sat staring at blank paper while around him, men who looked like corpses tried to sleep. Karl sat down beside him. Neither spoke for a long time. "Do you think we'll take the city?" Karl finally asked. Hans looked at the ruins visible through the broken window. Looked at the fires still burning after 2 months of fighting. Looked at Karl's haunted eyes. "No," Hans said. "I think the city is taking us." October became November. The temperature dropped below freezing. The Volga began to ice over. Hans's company, what remained of it, held a section of the Red October factory against daily Soviet attacks. They ate half rations. They wore summer uniforms padded with newspaper. They burned broken furniture to stay warm. Hoffman died on November 15th. Not dramatically. A sniper shot him while he was checking positions. One moment giving orders, the next moment falling. Hans held the major's hand while he bled out, listening to him try to say something that never quite formed into words. They buried him in the factory courtyard, under 2 feet of frozen earth. No ceremony, no words. Just another body added to thousands. Karl took Hoffman's death hardest. He'd stopped talking entirely by then, just sat cleaning his rifle over and over, checking the mechanism, loading and unloading the same magazine. Hans tried reaching him, but it was like talking to a ghost. On November 18th, Karl walked out into no man's land during a Soviet artillery barrage. Just stood up and walked away from cover while shells fell around him. Hans screamed his name. Others tried to grab him. Karl kept walking until a shell landed close enough to erase him. Hans wrote about it that night. Not to his mother. To Karl's mother, because someone had to tell her. Your son died bravely in service to Germany. He saved many lives. He never showed fear. These are the things I should tell you, but the truth is that this place broke him. It breaks everyone. He chose his end rather than waiting for it to choose him. I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry. He never sent the letter. The next morning, November 19, 1943, the Soviet artillery opened up with a barrage unlike anything they'd experienced before. Thousands of guns firing simultaneously. The earth shook. The factory walls cracked. Men huddled in basements while the world ended above them. When it stopped, Hans climbed to the surface and looked north. The sky was full of flares and explosions. The radio in the command post crackled with panicked transmissions. Something had happened. Something big. The new captain. A man Hans didn't know who'd arrived 2 days ago gathered them in the basement. His face said everything before he spoke. The Soviets have broken through the Romanian lines north and south of the city. They're attempting an encirclement. Division says it's under control. Hans looked at Joseph, who looked at the others. Nobody believed it was under control. That night, writing by the light of a candle burning furniture polish. Because they had no more candles, Hans wrote his last letter home for a long time. Mother, I do not know if this will reach you. I do not know if I will see you again. The summer of certainty is over. Winter has come, and with it, judgment for our pride. We marched east singing. We believed ourselves invincible. We learned that some cities cannot be conquered because they have already accepted death, and there is no victory over an enemy who does not fear dying. If I do not return, please know I loved you. Please know I tried to be the son you raised. Please forgive me for what I became here. He folded it, put it in an envelope, gave it to the mail clerk, who looked at him with empty eyes. Outside, the temperature dropped to -15. Inside, the men prepared for whatever was coming next, though none of them could imagine what that would be. The trap they'd built for Stalin was closing, but the question nobody dared speak was simple and terrible. Who was inside it? The question answered itself 3 days later. November 22nd, dawn. Hans stood watch on the factory roof when he saw them coming from the south. Not Germans. Soviet tanks, dozens of them rolling across the steppe where their supply lines used to be. He grabbed the field telephone, hand numb with cold even through his glove. Command post, this is observation point 3. I have enemy armor bearing south-southwest distance, 8 kilometers moving west. Static. Then a voice he didn't recognize, high and thin with barely controlled panic. Confirmed. They've linked up. The encirclement is complete. Hans lowered the phone. Below him in the factory's frozen courtyard, men were emerging from shelters to start another day of survival. They didn't know yet. In 30 minutes they would. In 30 minutes, someone would tell them they were trapped. He climbed down the ladder, one-handed, his rifle slung across his back. Joseph was heating water over a small fire made from broken furniture, trying to make something resembling coffee from grounds they'd already used twice before. We're surrounded, Hans said. Joseph didn't look up, just kept stirring the pot with a piece of wire. I know. How? Radio's been going crazy since 0400, officers trying to sound calm and failing. Joseph finally met his eyes. Division says the Führer has ordered us to hold. No retreat. Relief force is coming. Do you believe that? Joseph poured the brown water into 2 tin cups, handed one to Hans. It was barely warm and tasted like rust. Does it matter what I believe? They drank in silence while around them, the factory came alive with the routines of men who'd forgotten what normal life looked like. Someone was singing quietly an old folk song about going home. Someone else told him to shut up. A fistfight started and ended before anyone had the energy to make it serious. The new captain, whose name Hans still hadn't learned, appeared in the courtyard carrying a sheaf of papers. He was maybe 30, but looked 50, face hollowed out by 2 months of Stalingrad. He didn't climb up on anything or call for attention, just started talking, and men gathered because there was nothing else to do. Orders from Army Group Headquarters. 6th Army is to hold Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe will supply us by air until a relief force breaks through. Current rations are reduced to half. All available ammunition is to be conserved for defensive operations only. For how long? Someone asked. The captain looked at the paper like it might have an answer he'd missed. Until relief arrives. When is that? Soon. The word hung in the frozen air, meaning everything and nothing. Hans watched the captain fold the orders and put them in his coat pocket. Watched him try to meet the eyes of men who'd stopped believing in soon, or relief, or anything except the next hour of staying alive. Sir? Joseph stood up. How much food do we have? Enough. How much is enough? The captain's jaw tightened. Enough, soldier. Now get back to your posts. They dispersed. Hans and Joseph returned to their section of the factory, a machine shop that still had part of its roof. 17 men lived here now, down from 42 3 weeks ago. They'd carved up the space with salvaged metal sheets, creating tiny private areas that gave an illusion of individuality in a world that had erased such things. Hans found his corner, a space barely large enough to lie down in, marked by a piece of chalk on the concrete. Lt. Albrecht, 267th. His possessions fit in a canvas bag, extra socks with holes in them, a spare shirt, a razor he hadn't used in a month, and 63 letters he'd written, but never sent because the mail flights stopped coming. He pulled out the newest one, the one he'd written 3 days ago to his mother, read it again, crossed out a line, and added another. The Volga is freezing. Soon we will be able to walk across it, the Soviets say, if we survive that long. I think about our house in Bavaria often. The way snow looked on the mountains in December. The smell of your Christmas cooking. These memories are what keep me human when everything else tries to make me forget. Still writing. Private Ernst Weber sat down next to him without invitation. Weber was 23 and had been in Stalingrad since August. His left hand was wrapped in bandages, 2 fingers lost to frostbite. Who are you writing to? My mother. Does she write back? I don't know. Haven't gotten mail in 5 weeks. Weber pulled out a cigarette broken in half to make it last longer and lit it with shaking hands. My wife's pregnant, due in January. I might have a son and I'll never know it. He took a drag, coughed. You think the Luftwaffe will actually supply us? Hans didn't answer, because they both knew the answer. The math was simple. The 6th Army needed 500 tons of supplies per day to survive. The Luftwaffe had promised 300 tons. On the first day of the airlift, they'd delivered 100 tons. Yesterday, 75 tons. The numbers went in only one direction. My father was in the Great War, Weber said, staring at nothing. Verdun. He used to tell me about the trenches. How they waited for relief that never came. How they ate rats and boot leather when the food ran out. How men went mad from the waiting. He flicked ash onto the concrete. I used to think he was exaggerating, trying to scare me into being a good citizen or something. And now I think he left out the worst parts because words weren't enough. That afternoon, the first supply drop came. Hans watched from the factory roof as 3 Ju-52 transport planes appeared low over the city, their engines laboring against the cold. Soviet anti-aircraft fire reached up for them, black puffs of smoke blooming in the gray sky. One plane took a hit trailing smoke but kept flying. The others dropped their cargo and turned west, running for safety. The supplies landed 2 kilometers away in Soviet-controlled territory. Hans climbed down and found Joseph already organizing a patrol to try to retrieve the containers. 12 men volunteered. They left at dusk. 7 came back. They'd gotten within 500 meters before Soviet machine guns forced them back. The supplies were lost. "Tomorrow we try again," the captain said. "We need that food." But tomorrow brought worse news. The temperature dropped to -25°C. 2 men died in their sleep from the cold, just stopped breathing, and never started again. The medic, a corporal named Friedrich, who'd been a veterinarian in civilian life, examined the bodies with clinical detachment. "Hypothermia combined with malnutrition," he announced. "Their bodies couldn't generate enough heat. We'll see more of this." "How many more?" Hans asked. Friedrich looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "All of us eventually. We're burning more calories staying warm than we're taking in. The human body can't sustain that. It's mathematics." "How long?" "If rations stay at current levels. 6 weeks, maybe 8 if we're lucky and it doesn't get colder." "It's going to get colder." "I know." They buried the bodies in the courtyard next to Hoffman and 20 others. No markers, no names. Just mounds of frozen earth that would soon be covered by snow. The captain said words nobody listened to. Then they went back to their positions because guards still had to be posted, even when guarding meant nothing. December arrived with blizzards that turned the city into a white hell. Hans lost track of days. Time became measured in other ways. Between airdrops, between Soviet attacks, between friends dying. Joseph started keeping a count on the wall of their shelter, scratch marks for each man in their company who didn't wake up. 27, Joseph said one morning, adding another mark. 27 in 10 days. The Soviets aren't killing us. The cold is. Hans was trying to heat a can of horse meat over a small fire made from pages ripped from a Soviet propaganda book they'd found. The meat was frozen solid and barely warming. His stomach had stopped hurting 3 days ago, gone numb like everything else. "We should eat less," he said. "We're already eating less." "Then less than that. Make it last longer." Joseph laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Last until what?" "Until the relief force that isn't coming. Until the airlift that can't deliver enough. Until spring." He stood up suddenly, kicking over the fire. "There is no until, Hans. There's only now, and now is killing us." The outburst drew attention. Weber appeared from his corner, moving carefully like an old man, though he was 23. "Keep your voice down. The captain hears you talking like that, he'll have you shot for defeatism." "Let him shoot me." Joseph's voice had gone flat. "At least I'd be warm. Have you noticed the only warm places in this entire fucking city are next to the dead? They're still generating heat from decay. I slept next to a corpse last night because I was so cold I couldn't feel my feet." Weber grabbed Joseph's coat and shoved him against the wall. Not hard. Neither had the strength for hard. "You need to shut up, right now. We're all thinking the same things, but we don't say them because saying them makes them real." "They're already real," Joseph whispered. "Then keep them inside." Weber let go, stepped back. "We survive by not talking about it. By pretending tomorrow will be better. By lying to ourselves until the lies are all we have left." Hans stood between them. "Both of you stop. We're on the same side." "Are we?" Joseph looked at him. "What side is that? The losing side? The dying side?" He pulled away and walked to the doorway, stared out at the snow falling on ruins. "I'm 19 years old. I was supposed to go to university, study engineering, meet a girl, have a life." His voice broke. "Instead, I'm in hell watching friends freeze to death while eating horse meat and burning books to stay alive." Nobody had an answer for that because there wasn't one. The next supply drop came December 8th. Hans was on a patrol checking positions when he saw the planes. 4 of them this time flying in tight formation. Soviet fighters intercepted them before they reached the drop zone. Hans watched one Ju-52 explode mid-air, men and supplies tumbling out in a slow-motion rain of fire and metal and bodies. The other three dropped their loads and fled. This time, the supplies landed inside German lines. Hans's patrol reached them first, 6 containers. They cracked them open with shaking hands and found bread frozen solid. Ammunition they didn't need because they were conserving fire. Medical supplies that might have been useful 2 months ago. And cigarettes. Thousands of cigarettes. Weber started laughing. Then crying. Then both at once. They sent us cigarettes. We're starving, and they sent us fucking cigarettes. Hans took a carton and handed it to Joseph. At least we can trade them. Trade them for what everyone has: cigarettes. Nobody has food. But Hans was wrong about that. That night he learned that some people still had food. He discovered it by accident checking on the men in his section and found Private Otto Becker eating something that wasn't horse meat or black bread. Eating it quickly, furtively, trying to finish before anyone noticed. "What is that?" Hans asked. Becker swallowed, wiped his mouth. "Nothing, sir." "Show me." Becker hesitated, then pulled out a package wrapped in paper. Inside was cheese, real cheese, and a piece of chocolate. "Where did you get this?" "Found it, sir." "Found it where?" Becker wouldn't meet his eyes. "In the supply drop. It was just lying there, and I thought nobody else saw it. Nobody else needs to know." Hans took the package, looked at it, looked at Becker's terrified face. Thought about Joseph's scratch marks on the wall. 27 dead in 10 days. Thought about Weber's missing fingers. Thought about the mathematical certainty that they were all going to die here unless something changed. He handed the package back. "Next time you find something, you share it with your squad. We survive together or we die together. Understand?" "Yes, sir." But Hans knew the truth even as he said it. They weren't dying together. They were dying alone, one by one, in a city that had become a machine designed to extract life and leave only ghosts. The machinery of war had reduced them to numbers on casualty reports. The bureaucracy of survival had stripped away everything except animal needs. Food, warmth, sleep. They were becoming less than human, and everyone knew it. December 15th brought new orders. All available men were to report to the western perimeter. The Soviets were massing for an attack. Hans gathered his section 19 men, who looked like concentration camp prisoners in German uniforms. They moved through the factory complex to the assembly point, where the captain was trying to organize them into something resembling a military unit. "Intelligence reports a major offensive coming," the captain said. He'd stopped trying to sound confident. Now he just sounded tired. "We hold this factory, that's all. Just hold it." "With what?" someone asked. "We have 10 rounds per man." "Then make them count." The attack came at dawn. Not the massive human wave assaults of September, but something more calculated. Soviet infantry supported by tanks, probing for weak points, exploiting gaps. Hans's section held the second floor of a machine shop. They had 2 machine guns with limited ammunition, and rifles they'd cleaned so many times the barrels were wearing smooth. The Soviets hit them from 3 sides at once. Hans fired carefully, each shot aimed, each bullet precious. Next to him, Joseph was doing the same. Weber had the machine gun and was laying down short controlled bursts. They held for 20 minutes. Then the ammunition ran out. "Fix bayonets," Hans ordered. His voice sounded strange, calm, disconnected from the terror in his chest. "They want this floor. They'll have to take it hand to hand." But the Soviets pulled back, just stopped attacking, and disappeared into the ruins. Hans waited, rifle ready, bayonet fixed. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. "Why'd they stop?" Joseph whispered. Weber had the answer. "They don't need to take it. They're just bleeding us, making us use ammunition, making us expend energy we don't have. They're waiting for winter to kill us so they don't have to." Hans knew he was right. The Soviets had learned. They'd learned that Stalingrad devoured attackers and that patience was their best weapon. They could afford to wait. The Germans couldn't. That night, Hans sat in his corner writing by the light of a candle made from rendered fat. His letter was shorter than usual. His hands hurt too much from the cold to write more. Mother, we are still here, still fighting, still hoping, though hope grows harder each day. The men around me are good soldiers, but they are becoming something else, something harder, something necessary. I don't know if the person who comes home, if I come home, will be someone you recognize. I don't know if I'll recognize myself, but I am still your son. Please remember that. When everything else is gone, I am still your son. He folded it, added it to the pile of unsent letters. 64 now, a record of slow dissolution written one page at a time. Joseph appeared in the doorway, moving carefully, favoring his left side, where a piece of shrapnel had caught him 3 days ago. Friedrich had bandaged it, but they had no medicine for infection. It was starting to smell. You need to see something, Joseph said. Hans followed him to the factory's eastern wall, where a hole in the brickwork offered a view across no man's land toward Soviet positions. In the distance, fires burned, lots of them, more than usual. What am I looking at? Watch. Hans watched. After a minute, he saw it. Figures moving around the fires. Not soldiers on patrol, but people. Civilians. Hundreds of them. They were cooking, talking, living. On the Soviet side of the ruins, life continued. On the German side, only survival. They have supplies, Joseph said quietly. Food, medicine, warmth, everything we don't have. The Volga is frozen now. They're bringing it across the ice at night. Trucks, sleds, everything. How do you know? I've been watching. Every night they get stronger while we get weaker. Joseph turned away from the hole. We're not in a siege, Hans. We're in a grave. They've already buried us. They're just waiting for us to realize it. Hans wanted to argue but couldn't. The evidence was there in every frozen corpse, every empty ammunition box, every flight of supply planes that brought cigarettes instead of food. They were dying mathematically, predictably, and nobody was coming to save them. But still they held. Because the orders said, hold. Because the Führer said, hold. Because surrendering meant admitting the unthinkable. That they'd lost. That the invincible Wehrmacht could be defeated. That all the death and suffering had been for nothing. So they held. Through Christmas, which came and went, unmarked, except for someone singing Silent Night until an officer told him to stop because it was bad for morale. Through New Year's, which nobody celebrated because counting years required believing in futures. Through January, as the temperature dropped further and men started dying in their sleep at a rate that made Friedrich stop keeping records. Hans marked time by the letters he wrote and couldn't send, by the scratch marks Joseph made on the wall, by the slow transformation of men he'd known into hollow-eyed strangers who'd forgotten how to smile, how to hope, how to be anything except machines designed to survive one more hour. On January 8, 1943, Friedrich came to Hans with his medical bag open. Inside were 3 morphine syrettes, the last ones in the entire company. I need to tell someone, Friedrich said. The wounded are asking me to help them die, not just asking, begging, and I don't know what to tell them anymore. Hans looked at the morphine, understood what Friedrich was really saying. What do you want from me? Permission, or orders, or just someone to say it's okay to be merciful when orders say otherwise. They stood in silence, while around them the factory creaked and groaned in the cold. Finally, Hans spoke. I can't give you that. Nobody can give you that. Some decisions you make alone and live with forever. Friedrich nodded, slowly closed his bag. Then I guess I'll have to figure out what I can live with. He walked away. Hans never asked what he decided. Some things were better left unknown. But through it all, through the cold and hunger and slow dying, small acts of humanity persisted. Weber shared his last piece of bread with Joseph when Joseph was too weak to stand. Someone whose name Hans never learned gave him his gloves when Hans's hands started showing signs of frostbite. Ernst spent 2 hours talking Private Schmidt through a panic attack, just talking, using words as medicine when medicine was gone. These moments didn't change anything, didn't alter the mathematics of starvation or the certainty of defeat. But they mattered. They were proof that the machinery of war hadn't completely succeeded in grinding away what made them human. Late one night, Hans found Joseph sitting alone in the dark, not speaking, not moving, just sitting. Hans sat next to him. "You still there?" Hans asked. Joseph didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was barely a whisper. "I think about home sometimes. Really think about it. The way the bakery smelled on Sunday mornings, the sound of church bells, my mother's voice. And I can't remember if those things were real or if I invented them to have something to hold on to." They were real. How do you know? How do you know anything anymore when everything here is death and cold and madness? Hans had no answer except the one he'd been holding on to since November. Because we remember them. Because we're still here trying to be human when everything tells us to stop. That has to mean something. Does it? Joseph turned to look at him, and in the dim light, Hans saw tears frozen on his cheeks. Or does it just mean we're too stubborn to accept what we've become? Outside, the wind picked up howling through the ruins, like the voice of the city itself. Inside, men who'd been soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat, because it was all they had left to share. The Soviet fires burned in the distance, a reminder of everything they'd lost. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was singing again so quietly Hans couldn't make out the words, only the melody of a song about going home. The singing stopped on January 10th, when the Soviet loudspeakers started. Hans was on watch in the factory's north tower, a position that offered clear views across the frozen Volga and the Soviet positions beyond. The first broadcast came at dawn, a woman's voice speaking German with a slight accent, words carrying across the snow with unnatural clarity. "German soldiers, you are surrounded. You are starving. Your Führer has abandoned you. Surrender, and you will be fed, clothed, and sent home after the war. Continue fighting, and you will die here in the cold. The choice is yours." Hans turned away from the loudspeaker's direction and found Weber standing behind him, face blank. "Do you believe her?" Weber asked. "Does it matter?" "It might." Weber pulled out a cigarette, his hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to light it. "I've been doing the math. We have food for maybe 2 more weeks. Ammunition for 1 major engagement. Medicine for nobody. The relief force hasn't come. It's not coming. We have our orders. Our orders are killing us." Weber took a drag, coughed. "I'm not talking about surrender. I'm talking about reality. We can't hold. We can only die slowly or die quickly." Before Hans could respond, Joseph appeared at the top of the ladder, moving like each step cost him something irreplaceable. His face had taken on the waxy quality they all recognized, now the look that said, a man was using his body's last reserves. "Captain wants all officers in the command post, now." The command post was in what used to be the factory manager's office, a room with 3 walls and a roof held up by prayer and salvaged timber. 12 officers gathered there, down from 40 in September. The captain stood behind a desk covered in maps that no longer matched reality. Behind him, a radio man monitored a set that crackled with static and desperate transmissions from other units facing the same mathematics of extinction. "Gentlemen, I won't insult you by pretending this is anything but what it is." The captain's voice had gone hollow, scraped clean of everything except exhaustion. "Army Group Headquarters confirms the relief operation has been postponed. Current supply levels are insufficient. Casualties from cold and starvation exceed combat losses by a factor of 3 to 1. Sir, Lieutenant Gerhard Meyer, commander of the artillery support that no longer had shells to fire. Permission to speak freely." "Granted. We're dying, not fighting. Dying. Every day we lose men who just don't wake up. We're executing soldiers for stealing food from corpses because that's what the regulations say to do. We're burning our own wounded for warmth because we have no fuel. At what point does military discipline become murder? The room went silent. Nobody breathed. Meyer had said what they were all thinking, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that thinking it never could. The captain's hand went to his holster. Not drawing, just touching it, a gesture that said he was considering the regulations that demanded he shoot Meyer for defeatism. His hand stayed there for 5 seconds, then dropped. At what point? The captain's voice cracked. I don't know. Maybe we passed it weeks ago and nobody told us. Maybe we passed it when we marched into this city thinking we could conquer it. Maybe discipline became murder the moment we stopped being soldiers and became numbers on a casualty list nobody in Berlin bothers to read. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking ancient. Dismissed. Get back to your positions. Hold as long as you can. That's all we can do. Hans returned to his section and found Friedrich working on Private Schmidt, who'd collapsed during the night shift. The medic had him wrapped in every available blanket, trying to get his core temperature up, but Schmidt's lips were blue and his breathing shallow. Is he going to make it? Hans asked. Friedrich didn't look up. No, his body's eating itself. Organ failure. Even if I had proper medicine, even if I could get him warm, he's past the point where his system can recover. He finally met Hans's eyes. He has maybe 6 hours. I can keep him comfortable. That's all. Does he know? I think so. He asked me to write his wife. Tell her he tried. Tell her he thought about her every day. Tell her not to let their son become a soldier. Hans knelt beside Schmidt, who was 24, and had shown Hans pictures of his wife and baby so many times, Hans could draw them from memory. Schmidt's eyes were open, but unfocused, seeing something beyond this room. Schmidt, can you hear me? A slight nod. Is there anything you need? Anything I can do? Schmidt's mouth moved. Hans leaned closer to hear the whisper. Tell them. Tell them we didn't run. Whatever else, we didn't run. I'll tell them. Schmidt died 3 hours later without waking again. Friedrich used the last of their morphine to make it easier. They buried him in the courtyard, which now held so many bodies they had to dig in layers. The captain said words from a prayer book. Nobody listened because prayers had stopped meaning anything except a ritual performed to remember what being human used to feel like. That afternoon, Hans was checking the perimeter when he found Ernst and Josef in a maintenance tunnel, crouched over something hidden behind a pile of rubble. They startled when they heard him moved to cover whatever they'd been examining. Show me, Hans said. Ernst hesitated, then stepped aside. Behind the rubble was a canvas bag. Inside the bag was food. Not the half rations they were issued, but real food. Bread, tinned meat, sugar. Enough for maybe 10 men for 3 days. Where did this come from? We found it, Joseph said quickly, too quickly. Found it where? Neither answered. Hans looked from Joseph to Ernst, saw guilt and defiance mixed in equal measure. You took it from the supply depot. We borrowed it, Ernst said. We were going to share it with the section, just our guys, the ones who've been with us since the beginning. While others starve. Others are starving anyway. Joseph's voice rose sharp with anger and desperation. We've been doing everything right, following orders, sharing rations, watching friends die. And for what? So we can die too, but feel good about following regulations. We're not soldiers anymore, Hans. We're just animals trying to survive. Don't tell me you haven't thought about it. Hans had thought about it. Every day he thought about it. Thought about taking more than his share. About letting someone else stand the dangerous watches. About using his rank to ensure his own survival at the expense of others. The thoughts came automatically now. Animal instincts overwhelming training and conscience. Put it back. Hans, put it back now, before anyone else finds out. And if I don't, Joseph's hand moved toward the pistol on his belt. Not threatening, not quite, but the gesture was there. "Are you going to shoot me? Turn me in. Watch them execute me for the crime of wanting to live." They stood facing each other in the tunnel's dim light. Hans's hand was on his own pistol. He didn't remember putting it there. For a moment anything could happen. Then Ernst spoke, his voice shaking. "Please, both of you, we're friends. We've kept each other alive this long. Don't do this." Joseph's hand moved away from his pistol. Hans did the same. The moment passed but left something broken between them that would never fully heal. "Put half back," Hans finally said. "Take the other half to your squad. Tell them to eat it slowly and tell no one. If you get caught, I know nothing about this. Understood?" Joseph nodded. Ernst gathered up the bag. They disappeared into the tunnel's darkness, and Hans was left alone, wondering if he'd just saved their lives or doomed his soul. The line between survival and murder had always been clear in training. In Stalingrad, the line didn't exist. Only choices that got you through the next hour. January 15th brought new orders that changed nothing. The Sixth Army was to break into hedgehog positions, circular defensive formations, designed to hold until relief arrived. Hans's company was assigned a sector of the Barricadi factory, a space roughly 200 meters square, containing ruins that had been fought over so many times, nobody remembered who'd held it first. They moved in during a blizzard, 53 men carrying everything they owned through waist-deep snow. The factory was a maze of collapsed steel and frozen concrete. They found positions in the basement-level spaces that offered protection from wind and artillery, but turned into tombs if the Soviets dropped the building on top of them. "Home sweet home," Weber muttered, looking at the frozen water pooled on the basement floor, the walls black with soot from fires long extinguished. "At least it's out of the wind." They organized by instinct, now no longer needing orders. Positions established, watches assigned, supplies inventoried. The inventory took 5 minutes because they had almost nothing. Ammunition 43 rounds per rifle. Food enough for 3 more days at current rations. Medicine none. Fuel whatever they could burn. That night, huddled around a fire made from furniture scavenged from the floors above, Hans watched his men and tried to remember what they'd looked like in June. Tried to remember Karl's laugh, Hoffman's calm competence, the naive enthusiasm of boys who'd thought they were invincible. The men around this fire bore no resemblance to those soldiers. They were hollow-eyed specters, bodies consuming themselves, minds narrowed to the single focus of surviving one more day. "I saw a dog today," Weber said suddenly. "First living animal I've seen in this city in 2 months. It was eating something in the rubble. I tried to catch it, thought maybe we could eat it, but it ran away." He laughed without humor. "A starving dog ran from us. What does that say?" "Says the dog was smart," Joseph answered. He was sharpening his bayonet with a whetstone over and over the repetitive motion of a man who needed something to do with his hands. "Smarter than us anyway. We had the chance to run in November. Didn't take it. Following orders isn't running. No, it's just dying slower." Ernst threw a piece of wood on the fire, sending sparks spiraling toward the basement ceiling. "My grandmother used to tell me about the 30 Years' War, about armies that fought until there was nothing left to fight for. About soldiers who became bandits because they'd forgotten how to be anything else. I used to think she was telling fairy tales, old woman stories to scare children." "And now?" Hans asked. "Now I think she was warning me, telling me that war doesn't end when the fighting stops. It ends when the last person who remembers what peace felt like finally dies." They fell silent, each man alone with thoughts too dark to share. The fire burned low. Someone would have to go upstairs to find more fuel, brave the cold and the snipers for wood that would burn for maybe an hour. Nobody moved. The cold crept in through cracks in the walls, through gaps in their clothing, through the spaces between their ribs where flesh used to be. January 22nd, 1943. Friedrich came to Hans before dawn. his medic's bag empty except for bandages they'd made from torn uniforms. "We have a problem." Friedrich's voice was flat professional, the tone of a man delivering a diagnosis he knew was terminal. "Private Becker, his leg wound from last week. It's infected. Gangrene. Without antibiotics, without proper surgery, he has maybe 3 days before sepsis kills him." "What are you asking me?" "Permission to amputate, here, now, with a hacksaw and no anesthetic except whatever liquor we can find." Hans closed his eyes. Becker was 20 years old. The same Becker who'd hoarded food, who Hans had caught and forgiven. A boy who'd made a mistake and been given a second chance, now facing a choice that wasn't a choice. Does he know? He knows. He's asking for it. Begging for it. He doesn't want to die of infection. Wants a chance, however small. What are his odds? Of surviving the amputation, maybe 50-50. Of surviving long enough to be evacuated if relief comes, almost zero. He'll still need medicine. We don't have food, we don't have care, we can't provide. Friedrich's hands were shaking. "I'm asking you to authorize me to mutilate a boy knowing it probably won't save him. Just buy him a few more days of agony." Hans thought about regulations, about medical procedures, about the oath doctors took to do no harm, about how all of that meant nothing here in a basement where the difference between mercy and murder had collapsed into a single point too small to see. Do it. If he's asking for it, give him the chance. Friedrich nodded once and walked away. 2 hours later, Hans heard screaming from the medical area, screams that went on for 7 minutes before stopping. Becker survived the amputation, died 4 days later of shock and exposure, delirious at the end, calling for his mother in a voice that sounded like a child's. They buried him next to Schmidt in the courtyard that was running out of space for the dead. The Soviet loudspeakers continued their broadcasts, multiple times per day. Now different voices, different approaches. Sometimes threatening, sometimes cajoling, always offering the same thing: surrender and live, fight and die. The broadcasts gave times and locations where Germans could walk to Soviet lines with white flags and be taken prisoner. "Anyone tempted?" Weber asked one night. They were on watch together, sharing the last cigarette in the section, passing it back and forth like communion. To surrender, to believe them, to think maybe they're telling the truth and we'd actually be treated according to Geneva Conventions, fed, sheltered, sent home after the war. Hans took the cigarette, drew smoke he no longer felt. "You know what happens to prisoners. You've seen the intelligence reports. I've also seen what's happening here. Seen friends freeze to death. Seen Becker lose his leg. Seen men eating leather and wallpaper paste because there's nothing else." Weber's voice dropped to a whisper. "At least in a prison camp there's a chance. Here there's just mathematics. We have food for 2 more days, then nothing, and nobody's coming to save us." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe the Soviets aren't lying. Maybe they're being practical. We're defeated. Everyone knows it except Hitler. Why waste bullets on men who are already dead?" Hans handed back the cigarette. "Because the moment we believe that the moment we accept it, we've already surrendered. Not to the Soviets, but to the idea that this was all for nothing. That every friend we buried, every order we followed, every principle we held on to, was meaningless." "Maybe it was. Then what are we dying for?" Weber took a final drag and flicked the cigarette into the snow where it hissed and went dark. "I don't know anymore. I honestly don't know." January 26th brought the collapse everyone had been expecting and no one wanted to acknowledge. The western perimeter broke, not from a Soviet attack, but from attrition. The units holding it simply ceased to exist, dissolved by cold and hunger, and the mathematics of bodies that couldn't sustain themselves. The Soviets walked in and found positions abandoned except for frozen corpses and men too weak to retreat. Hans's section received orders to fall back to the factory's inner core, a space perhaps 50 meters square. They moved through ruins that had become familiar as home, past positions they'd held for weeks, leaving behind everything except weapons and the clothes on their backs. Joseph walked beside Hans carrying the company's last machine gun, though they had only 200 rounds for it. This is the end, isn't it? Not the attack, not some dramatic last stand, just slow collapse until there's nothing left. We're still here. Are we? Joseph stopped walking, stood in the snow, looking at Hans with eyes that had seen too much. Or are we just ghosts who haven't realized we're dead yet? Look at us. Look at what we've become. We eat our dead's rations. We burn their uniforms for warmth. We've forgotten what their faces looked like before the cold and hunger erased everything except the need to survive. Tell me how that's different from being dead. Hans had no answer because Joseph was right. They were ghosts, and Stalingrad was their haunting, and the only question left was how long before they admitted it. The new perimeter held 47 men from a company that had started with 150. They organized themselves in the factory's deepest basement, a space designed to store machinery that now stored the dying. Friedrich established a medical area in one corner where he tended wounds with no medicine and tried to keep men warm with no heat. That night, Hans sat in his assigned space, a section of floor marked with chalk that read, L.T.H. Albrecht, and pulled out his letters, 73 of them now, a paper record of dissolution. He read through them, these messages to a mother who might never know he'd written them, trying to find in his own words some trace of the person he'd been. One letter dated August 2, 1942, spoke about victory and confidence and being home by Christmas. The handwriting was clear, the sentences complete, the tone optimistic. Hans barely recognized it as his own. The most recent letter, dated yesterday, was 3 lines long. The handwriting shook. The ink was smudged where his frozen fingers couldn't grip the pen properly. Mother, we are still here. Tell Father I tried. I love you. Between those 2 letters lay the complete record of a man's disintegration. Hans folded them carefully, put them back in the canvas bag that held everything he owned. If he died, maybe someone would find them. Maybe someone would send them home. Maybe his mother would read them and understand that her son had tried to remain human, even as everything conspired to make him forget what human meant. Hans. Ernst appeared from the darkness, moving quietly. Come with me. There's something you need to see. Hans followed him through the basement to a storage room they'd been using for supplies. Inside, Weber and 3 others were gathered around a radio listening to a transmission that wasn't military traffic. Music, German music, a civilian station broadcasting from home. How did you get this? Hans asked. Found a working radio in the rubble. German civilian frequency. Weber adjusted the dial, bringing the signal clearer. It's a concert, live from Berlin. They're playing Beethoven. They stood in silence, 5 ghosts in a frozen basement, listening to music from a world they'd almost forgotten existed. The symphony swelled and fell, each note a reminder that somewhere beyond this city, beyond this war, beauty still existed. People still gathered in concert halls. Children still learned to play instruments. Life continued, even though theirs had stopped. When the concert ended, the announcer came on. His voice was cheerful, oblivious. That concludes tonight's performance from the Berlin Philharmonic. We hope you enjoyed this musical interlude. And now, news from the Eastern Front. Our brave soldiers continue their heroic stand at Stalingrad, inflicting heavy casualties on the Bolshevik hordes. Victory is assured. The Führer has promised that our men will be home soon. Weber reached over and turned off the radio. Nobody spoke. The lie was so enormous, so complete, that words couldn't contain it. They were dying here, forgotten and abandoned, while Berlin celebrated victories that didn't exist. They don't know, Ernst finally said. Or they know and don't care. Either way, we're already erased from history. Dead men who haven't stopped moving yet. Hans walked away, needing to be alone. He found a corner of the basement, where he could sit with his back against cold concrete and think about lies and truth and the distance between what was promised and what was real. He thought about the boy he'd been in June, believing in victory and the righteousness of his cause. thought about the ghost he'd become, hollowed out by cold and hunger, and the slow realization that everything he'd believed was built on sand. But even then, even in that moment of complete darkness, something persisted. He pulled out his pen and paper and began to write. "Mother, I am still your son. Whatever else I have become, whatever sins I have committed to survive, I am still the boy you raised. I hold on to that truth even when everything else is lies. And that has to mean something. It has to." He wrote until his fingers went numb and the candle burned down to nothing. Isambin wrote until words became the only defense against the darkness. And somewhere in that basement, other men were doing the same, finding, in small acts of humanity, the last threads of resistance against total dissolution. Sharing warmth, sharing memories, sharing the burden of survival in a place designed to erase everything except death. In the camp they'd built to silence men, whispers still escaped through the walls of frozen steel. The whispers stopped on January 28th, when General Paulus received his last communication from Hitler. Hans learned about it third hand through a radio man who'd overheard the transmission and couldn't keep silent. The message was brief. Hitler had promoted Paulus to field marshal, the highest rank in the German military. The implication was clear. No German field marshal had ever surrendered. The promotion was an order disguised as an honor. Fight to the death or take your own life. Those were the only options Hitler was offering. "He's telling him to die," Joseph said when Hans shared the news. They were in the basement watching Friedrich try to save Private Keller, who'd collapsed from starvation. Friedrich was rubbing Keller's hands trying to keep circulation going, but they both knew it was pointless. Keller's body was eating itself from the inside. He's sitting in his comfortable bunker in Berlin and telling men who fought for 6 months to die for his pride. Soldiers follow orders. Dead men follow orders. Soldiers think. Joseph stood up, abruptly walked to the wall where he'd been keeping his count. The scratch marks now covered 3 square meters of concrete. Each mark represented someone from their company who'd died. Hans counted quickly. Over 90 marks. "I'm done thinking. I'm done following. I'm done pretending this has meaning." "Joseph." "No, listen to me. Really, listen." Joseph's voice dropped to a whisper, urgent and desperate. 3 sections over the men are discussing surrender, walking out with white flags. Tomorrow morning before they're too weak to move. They're asking who wants to join them. Hans felt something cold that had nothing to do with temperature. "That's desertion. They'll be shot." "By who?" "The officers who are starving like us, the military police who died in November. There is no more Wehrmacht here. Just men deciding how they want to die." "And you're considering this?" "I'm considering living." Joseph grabbed Hans's arm, his grip weak but insistent. "Come with us, please. We walk out together. Whatever happens in a Soviet prison camp, it's better than freezing to death in this basement." Hans pulled away. "I can't." "Can't or won't?" "Both. If I walk out with a white flag, everything I've done, everyone who died following orders I gave, it's all for nothing. Karl, Hoffman, Schmidt, all of them died because we believed in something. If I surrender, I'm saying they were fools." "They were fools. We were all fools. The only question is whether we die for our foolishness or live with it." Before Hans could answer, Friedrich called out, "He's gone. Keller's gone." They gathered around the body. Keller was 26, married, had a daughter he'd never met, who would be 2 years old now. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. Friedrich closed them with fingers that shook. "That's 94, Joseph said, walking back to the wall to add another mark. 94 out of 150, and we still have 47 left to go. January 30th, 1943. 10 men from the 3rd section walked out into no man's land, carrying a white flag made from a torn sheet. Hans watched from a window as they moved slowly through the rubble, hands raised, calling out in broken Russian. Soviet soldiers appeared from concealed positions, weapons ready. There was a moment of tension where anything could happen. Then the Soviets lowered their weapons and motioned the Germans forward. Hans lost sight of them as they disappeared into Soviet lines. He never learned what happened to them. Never knew if they were fed and sheltered like the loudspeakers promised or shot as spies like some feared. They simply vanished, and their absence created a hole in the perimeter nobody had the strength to fill. "Does that make them traitors or survivors?" Weber asked. He was standing beside Hans, looking through the same window at the space where the men had disappeared. "I don't know anymore." "Neither do I, but I know this. 3 more days, maybe 4 if we're lucky. That's how long we have before we're too weak to make the choice. Then it's made for us." That afternoon, the captain gathered what remained of the company in the basement's main chamber. 23 officers and men, all that survived from a unit that had numbered 150 6 months ago. The captain looked ancient, his uniform hanging on a frame that had lost 40 pounds. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I have new orders from division. We are to hold this position until February 2nd. At that time, all units will make a final breakout attempt to reach German lines in the west." Silence. Then someone laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "German lines are 200 kilometers away. We have no fuel, no vehicles, no supplies. We can barely walk across this room. How are we supposed to break out?" The captain didn't answer because there was no answer. They all understood what the order really meant. It was permission to die attempting something impossible, rather than surrendering. A final gesture to preserve the illusion that the Wehrmacht never quit. "Sir?" Hans found himself speaking without planning to. "Permission to speak freely." "Granted. These men have followed every order, done everything asked of them, fought until there was nothing left to fight with. At what point does ordering them to continue stop being leadership and start being murder?" The captain met his eyes, and Hans saw in them complete understanding and complete helplessness. "When you figure that out, Lieutenant, let me know. Until then, we follow our orders because that's all we have left." He walked away, and the men dispersed, and Hans was left wondering if courage and cowardice were really different things, or just different names for the same survival instinct. That night, Joseph came to Hans carrying his rifle and 43 rounds of ammunition, everything he owned in the world. He set them down carefully and sat. "I'm leaving tomorrow morning, going to try for Soviet lines. I wanted you to know." Hans had been expecting this. "Alone. Ernst and Weber are coming. Maybe 5 others. We've talked it through, made our peace with it." Joseph pulled out a letter folded many times. "If I don't make it, if you survive, get this to my mother. Tell her I tried to be brave. Tell her I thought about her every day. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't be what she wanted." Hans took the letter, added it to his own collection. "I won't tell her you deserted." "Is that what you think this is, desertion?" "I think it's survival. Whether that's the same as desertion depends on who's judging." Joseph nodded slowly. "Fair enough. And what about you? Will you stay here and die following orders from men who don't care if you live?" "I'll stay because the alternative is admitting everything we suffered through was pointless. And I'm not ready to admit that yet." "Then I guess this is goodbye." Joseph stood, picked up his rifle. "For what it's worth, you were a good officer, better than we deserved. You tried to keep us human when everything wanted to make us animals. That counts for something." "Does it?" "Ask me in a week if we both survive that long." They shook hands, 2 ghosts in a frozen basement, saying farewell before walking different paths into darkness. Joseph disappeared into the tunnels where Ernst and Weber waited. Hans sat alone in his corner, holding letters written by dead men and wondering if words could outlive the bodies that formed them. February 1st, 1943. Hans woke to gunfire and shouting. He grabbed his rifle, still half asleep, and stumbled toward the sound. Found the captain and 3 others at the basement entrance firing at Soviet soldiers who'd infiltrated during the night. "They're in the building." The captain was firing methodically, 3-round bursts, making each bullet count. "First and second floors compromised. We fall back to the lower levels. Hans joined the line, found a target, fired. The Soviet soldier fell. Another appeared. Hans fired again. Beside him, Friedrich had abandoned his medical bag for a rifle shooting with the precision of someone who'd been a soldier long before he became a medic. The firefight lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, the Soviets had pulled back, but the cost was clear. The captain was wounded a bullet through his shoulder. Private Richter was dead, killed instantly by a shot to the head. And they'd used precious ammunition they couldn't replace. Friedrich worked on the captain in the medical area, the last corner of the basement where he maintained the illusion of being a doctor rather than a gravedigger. He had no antiseptic, no proper bandages, nothing except water boiled over a fire made from furniture and strips of cloth torn from the dead. "This will get infected," Friedrich said as he wrapped the wound. "Without antibiotics, you have maybe a week before sepsis sets in. A week is longer than I need." The captain's face was gray with pain, but his voice stayed level. "How many effectives do we have left?" 19 who can fight, maybe 10 who can walk, the rest—" Friedrich trailed off. "The rest are already gone, just don't know it yet." The captain stood slowly, testing his wounded shoulder. "Lieutenant Albrecht, you're now second in command. If I fall, you take over." "Sir." "That's an order. And my first order to you is this. When it's time, when there's no more ammunition and no more hope, you make sure these men don't suffer. You understand what I'm telling you?" Hans understood. The captain was giving him permission to show mercy when orders ran out. Permission to help men die rather than watch them freeze slowly. It was the last gift one soldier could offer another, and it weighed more than any medal. February 2nd came with temperatures dropping to -30°C. Hans was on watch when he heard engines in the distance. Not the rumble of Soviet tanks, but something different. Higher pitched. Familiar. German engines. He scrambled to the surface, ignoring the cold, and looked west. Through the ruins and falling snow he saw them. German vehicles, a convoy of trucks and half-tracks flying German flags. The relief force. They'd actually come. Hans ran back to the basement shouting, "They're here! The relief force is here!" Men who'd been lying motionless for days found the strength to move. They gathered weapons, checked ammunition, prepared to break out and link up with their rescuers. Hope, that dangerous poison, flooded back into veins that had been pumping only survival instinct. The captain organized them quickly. 19 men who could fight plus the wounded who refused to be left behind. They moved through the factory's tunnels toward the western exit, toward salvation, toward home. They emerged into daylight and saw the truth. The vehicles weren't relief forces. They were Soviet tanks painted with captured German markings, bait for exactly this trap. Machine guns opened up from 3 directions. Men fell. Hans hit the ground, returning fire, watching his company die in the snow. The captain was hit in the first volley, bullets stitching across his chest. He fell beside Hans, blood spreading across the white snow like ink on paper. His lips moved, trying to form words. Hans leaned close to hear the whisper. "End it. For God's sake, end it." But there was no ending it. Not yet. Hans grabbed 2 others and pulled them back into the factory while machine guns chewed up the walls around them. They made it to the tunnel entrance. Behind them, the firing continued. Then stopped. Then silence. Hans crawled back to the surface and looked out. 12 bodies in the snow, the captain among them. Soviet soldiers were moving through the ruins, checking the dead, collecting weapons. Hans pulled back before they saw him and returned to the basement where the survivors were gathering. 7 men. That's what remained of a company that had started with 150. 7 men in a basement with no ammunition, no food, no hope. Friedrich was sitting against a wall, his medical bag open and empty beside him. "I'm out. No bandages, no medicine, nothing. I can't even pretend to help anymore." "It doesn't matter." Hans sat down next to him. "We're done. The captain's dead. The breakout failed. We have maybe 12 hours before we're too weak to move. So what do we do?" Hans pulled out his pistol, checked the magazine. 7 rounds, 7 men. The mathematics was clear. We make a choice. Fight until the Soviets kill us. Surrender and hope they don't. Or end it ourselves before they can. Those are terrible options. They're the only options we have. They sat in silence while the remaining men gathered around. Nobody spoke. The weight of the decision pressed down on them like physical force. Then, Private Werner, youngest of the survivors at 19 years old, broke the silence. I vote surrender. I know what they say about Soviet camps. I know the odds. But I want a chance. However small. I want to believe I might see my family again. I'm with Werner, Friedrich said. I didn't survive 6 months of hell to die in the last hour. If there's even a chance the Soviets honor surrender terms, I'm taking it. The others agreed one by one. 6 men choosing life over death, hope over certainty. Only Hans remained silent. What about you? Friedrich asked. You coming with us? Hans thought about Karl and Hoffman and Schmidt and 91 others whose names were scratched on the basement wall. Thought about letters written to mothers who might never read them. Thought about promises made and broken and the question of whether survival meant victory or just postponed defeat. I'll come, he finally said. Not because I believe it's right, but because dying here alone serves nobody. They gathered what little they had, destroyed their weapons so they couldn't be used against other Germans, tore up any documents that might be valuable to Soviet intelligence, made a white flag from the last clean shirt anyone owned. And at dawn on February 3, 1943, they climbed out of the basement and walked toward Soviet lines with their hands raised. Soviet soldiers met them 50 meters from the factory. Young men Hans noticed no older than the Germans they were accepting surrender from. One spoke German well enough to make himself understood. You have weapons. No, we destroyed them. You have wounded. We're all wounded, just different kinds. The Soviet soldier nodded, almost sympathetic. You will be searched. Then you will be taken to processing center. Food there. Medical care. You cooperate, you will be treated fairly. You resist, you will be shot. Understand? They understood. The search was thorough, but not brutal. The Soviets took their watches, their medals, anything of value, but didn't beat them or shoot them. Then they were marched through ruins they'd fought over for months, seeing Stalingrad from the other side for the first time. The processing center was in what used to be a school. Hundreds of German prisoners were there already, sitting in the courtyard under Soviet guard, looking like the ghosts they'd become. Hans and his 6 joined them, collapsing into the snow because their legs couldn't hold them anymore. A Soviet officer moved through the prisoners, checking faces, taking notes. He stopped in front of Hans, studied him with dark eyes that held something like pity. You are officer. Lieutenant, 267th Infantry Regiment, 6th Army. You have been here since when? September. September. The officer shook his head. 6 months. And you are still alive. That is something. He moved on, and Hans was left wondering if being alive was something to be proud of or ashamed of. They spent 2 days in the processing center. Food came: thin soup and black bread, but food nonetheless. Hans's stomach rebelled at first, his body having forgotten how to process anything except scraps. Around him, men were eating and crying simultaneously, tears freezing on faces that hadn't shown emotion in months. Friedrich sat next to him, holding bread and shaking hands. We survived. I can't believe it, but we survived. Did we? Hans looked around at the hundreds of prisoners, hollow-eyed and broken. Or did we just change what we're dying from? Does it matter we're alive? That has to count for something. But Hans wasn't sure. He'd survived when 91 others hadn't. Would survive to carry their letters home, their last words, their final attempts to remain human in a place designed to erase humanity. Whether that made him lucky or cursed, he couldn't say. On February 5th, they were marched east away from Stalingrad toward prison camps in the Soviet interior. Hans looked back once at the city that had consumed so many. The ruins stretched to the horizon, black against white, a monument to hubris and suffering. Somewhere in those ruins lay Karl and Hoffman and 91 others whose names he could recite from memory. He turned away and kept walking. Behind him, Stalingrad burned on flames, still rising from the industrial district smoke, still climbing toward gray skies. The city had won. It had broken them completely, erased their certainty, destroyed their faith in everything except the next breath. Freedom had come, but not the freedom they'd imagined. Not liberation or victory or homecoming. Just the freedom to continue existing, to carry the weight of survival, while others had been granted the release of death. Freedom had arrived too late for thousands who'd vanished into the snow. Their names forgotten, their sacrifices, unrecorded except in letters that might never be read. Hans reached into his coat and touched the bundle of letters he'd carried from the basement. 73 of his own plus 12, written by others who hadn't survived to send them. The only proof that any of them had been human once before, Stalingrad taught them that humanity was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. He kept walking east into a future that promised nothing except more cold, more hunger, more mathematics of survival. But he was alive. And somewhere in that fact lay either redemption or damnation, and Hans no longer knew which he deserved. The march east lasted 19 days. Hans lost count after the first week, time collapsing into an endless rhythm of walking and stopping and walking again. The column of prisoners stretched for kilometers, thousands of men moving through a landscape stripped bare by war. Soviet guards walked alongside them, not cruel, but not kind either. Just men doing a job that required moving one group of broken soldiers from one place to another. Men died every day. They'd stop walking and sit down in the snow and never stand again. The guards didn't force them, didn't shoot them, just kept the column moving and let the cold finish what Stalingrad had started. Hans watched Friedrich try to help them, checking pulses, offering encouragement, but there was nothing medical skill could do when the body had simply decided it was done. 32 today, Friedrich said one evening as they huddled in a barn the Soviets had allowed them to use for shelter. 32 men who survived Stalingrad but couldn't survive the march. What does that say about victory? That there isn't any, Hans answered. Just different ways of losing. Weber was next to them writing something on a scrap of paper he'd found. His handwriting was shaky, words barely legible, but he kept writing with the intensity of a man who needed to record something before memory failed. "What are you writing?" Hans asked. "Names. Everyone from our company who didn't make it. Hoffman, Karl, Schmidt, all of them. Someone needs to remember." Weber's voice cracked. "Someone needs to know they were here, that they mattered, that they weren't just numbers on a casualty report. The army will have records. The army will have lies. Heroic last stands. Strategic withdrawals. Anything except the truth that we were abandoned and forgotten and left to die for nothing." He looked up and his eyes held something fierce and desperate. "These names need to survive. Promise me. If I don't make it, you'll carry this list. You'll tell people what really happened." Hans took the paper, added it to his collection of letters. "I promise." They reached the prison camp on February 24, 1943. It wasn't the death camp some had feared, but it wasn't salvation either. Just rows of barracks behind wire fences designed to hold thousands of men who'd surrendered from Stalingrad. The Soviets processed them efficiently, taking names and ranks and units, assigning them to barracks, providing food that was barely adequate and medical care that was barely existent. Hans's barracks held 200 men in a space designed for 80. They slept on wooden platforms without mattresses, 3 men to a space intended for 1. The first night, he lay awake listening to men cough and cry and call out names of people who weren't there. The sound was worse than artillery because it was human, and humanity in this place was unbearable. But they survived. Day by day, week by week, they survived. The Soviets worked them in labor details, rebuilding the roads and bridges the Germans had destroyed during their advance. The work was hard, but it gave them purpose, something to focus on besides the cold and hunger. Hans found himself paired with Friedrich on a detail clearing rubble in a town whose name he never learned. "I keep thinking about Becker," Friedrich said one day, as they moved stones from one pile to another. "The amputation. How he begged me to do it, even though we both knew it probably wouldn't save him. I dream about it sometimes. His screaming, the sound the saw made, the smell. You did what he asked. I mutilated a boy with a hacksaw and no anesthetic. That's what I did. And the worst part, I'd do it again. Because he asked me to. Because in that moment, giving him a chance, however small, was more merciful than letting him die of gangrene." Friedrich dropped the stone he was carrying and sat down suddenly. "How do I live with that? How do I go home and practice medicine and pretend I'm not someone who sawed off a boy's leg in a basement?" Hans sat beside him. A Soviet guard was watching them, but didn't intervene. The guards had learned that sometimes prisoners needed to stop and remember how to breathe. You live with it by remembering why you did it, by carrying Becker's choice forward, by making sure his last act of courage meant something. Hans pulled out the bundle of letters he still carried, found the one Becker had written 3 days before he died. He wrote his mother, told her he wasn't afraid, told her he trusted his doctor, told her to be proud of him. Maybe someday we get to deliver this. Maybe she gets to know her son died believing in something. Does that make it better? No, but it makes it bearable. March became April. The snow melted, revealing the landscape they'd been walking through. Hans was assigned to a new detail, sorting through German equipment the Soviets had captured. Thousands of items, everything from rifles to belt buckles to personal effects taken from the dead. His job was to separate military equipment from personal items, the former to be recycled, and the latter to be catalogued in case families ever inquired. It was in a warehouse full of these personal effects that Hans found Joseph's identification tags. He stood holding them, these 2 pieces of stamped metal that represented all that remained of his friend. Joseph Schneider, born March 15, 1923, Catholic blood type, O. Hans remembered Joseph's face the last time he'd seen him, remembered him saying he was going to try for Soviet lines with Ernst and Weber, remembered thinking he might survive. The tags said otherwise. Hans asked the Soviet officer overseeing the warehouse if he could check the records for 2 other names, Ernst Weber, Wilhelm Hoffmann. The officer looked at him with something like sympathy and checked a ledger. Weber Ernst, died February 8, 1943, pneumonia during transport to prison camp. And Hoffmann Wilhelm, that is your officer, the major. Yes. The Soviet officer turned pages, found the entry. Killed November 15, 1942, sniper fire. This is recorded in our combat logs. He was a good officer. Our men respected him even as enemy. Hans thanked him and walked outside where he could be alone. He sat on the ground with his back against the warehouse wall and let himself feel what he'd been holding back since November. Hoffmann, who'd tried to warn them. Karl, who'd broken and walked into artillery fire. Joseph, who'd chosen surrender and died anyway. Ernst, who'd survived Stalingrad, only to die of pneumonia in a cattle car. He pulled out his letters and added Joseph's tags to the bundle. Evidence that these men had existed, that they'd fought and suffered and tried to remain human in circumstances designed to erase humanity. The weight of carrying their memory was becoming unbearable, but Hans couldn't put it down. Someone had to remember. Someone had to bear witness. The years blurred. 1943 became 1944, became 1945. News filtered into the camp through whispers and rumors and the changing attitudes of guards. The war was going badly for Germany. The Allies had landed in France. The Red Army was pushing west. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Hans received this last piece of news in May 1945, while working in a field planting potatoes. The Soviet guard who told him seemed to expect some reaction, but Hans felt nothing. Hitler's death changed nothing for him. Wouldn't bring back the 91 dead, wouldn't erase Stalingrad, wouldn't make the letters he carried any less heavy. "Do you hate him?" the guard asked. He was young, maybe 25, and spoke German well. "Your Führer who sent you to die in our city?" Hans thought about it, really thought. "No, hate requires energy I don't have. I just feel empty. Like everything that made me who I was, burned away in Stalingrad, and this is all that's left." "You are still alive. That is not nothing. Isn't it?" The guard had no answer. He walked away, and Hans continued planting potatoes in soil that had been fertilized with the ashes of war. The repatriation began in 1947. Not all prisoners, not immediately, but gradually the Soviets started releasing Germans to return home. Hans's name came up in January 1948, nearly 5 years after his surrender. He stood in line with 50 others waiting to be processed, carrying nothing except the clothes on his back, and a canvas bag containing 85 letters written by men who would never go home. Friedrich was in the line, 3 people ahead. They'd survived the camp together, worked together, kept each other sane through years of captivity. Friedrich turned back and gave Hans a small nod. It said everything that needed saying. They'd made it. Against all odds and mathematics, they'd survived. The train journey west took 4 days. Hans watched the landscape change from Soviet territory to occupied Germany to finally improbably Bavaria. The mountains were still there. The villages were still there. But everything felt smaller, less significant. How could he explain Stalingrad to people who'd lived in these peaceful valleys? How could he tell them about the basement and the cold and the slow dissolution of everything human? He arrived at his mother's house on a Wednesday afternoon in February 1948. 5 years and 8 months since he'd last seen her. He stood at the gate for 10 minutes before finding the courage to walk up the path. The door opened before he could knock. His mother stood there older and grayer, but still his mother and she looked at him like she was seeing a ghost. "Hans." "Hello, Mother." She pulled him inside, wrapped him in arms that were stronger than they looked, and cried into his shoulder while he stood there feeling nothing, because feeling had been burned away in a frozen city on the Volga. Eventually she pulled back and looked at him, really looked, and he saw the moment she understood that her son hadn't completely come home. "Are you hungry?" "Always." She made him food while he sat at the kitchen table that had been there his whole life. The normalcy of it was surreal. While she cooked, he pulled out the letters. "I have things to deliver. Letters from men who didn't make it. Promises to keep." His mother sat down across from him, looked at the bundle. "How many?" 85. Some written by me, most by others. All of them need to reach families who don't know what happened to their sons and brothers and husbands. That's a heavy burden. It's all I have left of them, the only proof they existed. If I don't deliver these, they disappear completely, and Stalingrad wins. Over the following months, Hans traveled across Germany delivering letters. Each delivery was its own small trauma. He'd knock on doors and tell mothers their sons had died. Give them final words written in frozen basements. Watch them read and cry and ask questions he couldn't answer without revealing how terrible it really was. Some families welcomed him. Others blamed him for surviving when their sons hadn't. One mother threw Joseph's letter back at him and slammed the door, unable to bear the messenger who brought confirmation of what she'd hoped wasn't true. Hans picked up the letter from the doorstep and added it back to his bundle. He'd try again later. The promise didn't expire just because it was difficult to keep. He found Karl's mother in June. She was living alone in a small apartment in Munich, and she invited him in like she'd been expecting him. Made tea. Sat across from him with hands folded in her lap. "He's dead, isn't he?" "Yes, ma'am." "How?" Hans told her. Not everything. Not the worst parts. But enough truth to honor Karl's memory. Told her about the friendship, the jokes, the way Karl had shared his last piece of bread, the moment he'd walked into artillery fire because the weight of survival had become too heavy to carry. He was sick, Karl's mother said. Even before the war. Depression, the doctors called it. Some days he couldn't get out of bed. I was terrified when they drafted him. Terrified the war would break him. She looked at Hans with eyes that had cried themselves dry long ago. Did it? Hans thought about Karl's last moment standing in no man's land while shells fell around him. Thought about the choice to end it on his own terms rather than waiting for Stalingrad to choose for him. Yes, but he fought it as long as he could. He was brave in ways that don't get medals. He survived longer than most of us thought possible. That's something, I suppose. She took the letter Hans offered, held it without opening it. Will you come back? Tell me more about him? I'd like to know who my son was at the end. I'll come back. And he did. Once a month for the next year, Hans would visit Karl's mother and tell her stories. Some true, some embellished to spare her the worst truths. She'd make tea and listen and sometimes cry and sometimes smile. And slowly Hans realized he was keeping Karl alive in the only way that mattered. Through memory, through story, through refusing to let silence erase what had happened. He delivered the last letter in March 1949, 6 years after Stalingrad. It was Hoffman's letter written to his wife 3 days before a Soviet sniper had killed him. Hans found her living in Hamburg, remarried to a schoolteacher trying to build a new life. She read the letter while Hans waited. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Thank you for bringing this. Wilhelm was a good man, a good officer. He deserved better than what he got. She poured coffee, and they sat in silence for a moment. What will you do now? Now that you've delivered all the letters. Hans hadn't thought about it. The letters had been his purpose for 6 years. I don't know. You could write about it, tell people what really happened. There are too many lies being told about the war, too many people trying to pretend it was glorious or necessary, or anything except what it was. What was it? A machine that ground up men and called it purpose. Someone needs to say that. Someone who was there and survived. Hans went home and started writing. Not letters this time, but testimony. A record of what had happened in Stalingrad from someone who'd lived through it. He wrote about the cold and the hunger and the slow dissolution of humanity. Wrote about Karl and Hoffman and Joseph and 91 others whose names deserve to be remembered. Wrote about the choice between following orders and following conscience, and how war made that choice impossible. The manuscript grew to 300 pages. He submitted it to publishers who rejected it. Too dark, they said. Too honest. People wanted stories about brave soldiers and noble sacrifice, not stories about men eating wallpaper paste and dying in frozen basements. But one publisher, a small press in Berlin, agreed to print it. The book appeared in 1952 under the title Letters from Stalingrad, a Testament. It sold modestly at first. Then word spread. Veterans read it and recognized their own experiences. Families of the dead read it and found answers to questions that had haunted them for years. Students read it and understood for the first time what war really meant. Hans received letters, hundreds of them. Some from veterans thanking him for telling the truth. Some from families grateful to know what had happened to their loved ones. Some from young people asking if war was always like this. If glory was always a lie. If there was any meaning to be found in the suffering. To that last question, Hans always answered the same way. The meaning isn't in the suffering. It's in what we do with the memory of it. In refusing to let those who died be forgotten. In bearing witness so that future generations understand the cost and maybe possibly choose differently. In 1965, Hans returned to Stalingrad. The Soviet government had opened the city to foreign visitors, and a group of German veterans had organized a pilgrimage to the battlefield. Hans joined them, though he wasn't sure why. What was there to see except ruins and memories? The city had been rebuilt. New apartment blocks and factories and monuments to Soviet victory. But Hans could still see the old city underneath, could trace the positions his company had held, could find the basement where they'd spent their last days of freedom. A Soviet veteran was leading the tour, a man about Hans's age, who'd fought in the 62nd Army. He and Hans ended up walking together, two old soldiers who'd tried to kill each other 22 years ago, now trying to make sense of what they'd been through. "You were here," the Soviet veteran asked. "September through February, 267th Infantry Regiment." "I was here too, 13th Guards Division. We fought in the Red October factory. My company took that in October, lost 40 men doing it. My company defended it, lost 60. The Soviet veteran stopped walking and looked at Hans. "For what?" "So the factory could change hands 15 times before it didn't matter anymore. So both our countries could claim victory while we counted the dead." They stood in silence on the bank of the Volga, watching the river flow past. The same river that had frozen solid in January 1943. The same river Soviet supplies had crossed while Germans starved. The same river that had marked the boundary between survival and extinction. "Do you hate me?" Hans asked. "For what we did to your city?" The Soviet veteran thought about it. "No. I hate what sent us here. The leaders who decided young men should die for their ambitions. But you're just another survivor carrying too much weight." "Will it always be this heavy?" "Yes, but that's how we honor them, by carrying it." Hans returned home and continued writing. More books, more testimony, speaking at schools and universities, answering questions from generations who'd never known war, always bringing with him a photograph of his company from June 1942, pointing out faces and speaking names. "This is Karl Fischer, died January 1943. This is Joseph Schneider, died February 1943. This is Wilhelm Hoffmann, died November 1942. Every name spoken was an act of resistance against forgetting. Every story told was proof that they'd existed, that they'd mattered, that Stalingrad hadn't completely erased them. In 1983, 40 years after Stalingrad, Hans received an invitation to speak at a ceremony dedicating a memorial to the German soldiers who died there. He almost declined. Memorials were for politicians and generals to make speeches about sacrifice and duty. But then he thought about the 85 letters he'd carried home, about the promises he'd made, about the burden of being a witness. He accepted. The memorial was a simple stone in a military cemetery outside Munich. Carved on it were the names of every German soldier confirmed killed at Stalingrad. Hans found Karl's name, Joseph's name, Hoffmann's name, 91 names from his company among thousands upon thousands of others. When it was his turn to speak, Hans stood before the memorial and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The list Weber had written during the march east, names scratched in shaking handwriting on a scrap of paper that had somehow survived. "These men didn't die for glory," Hans said. "They died because they followed orders in a war that should never have been fought. They died cold and hungry, and forgotten, believing that someone in Berlin cared about their sacrifice. No one did. The only thing that gives their deaths meaning is our refusal to let them be forgotten. Our insistence on speaking their names. Our determination to tell the truth about what happened so that maybe, just maybe, future generations will choose differently." He read the names, all 91 of them, spoke each one clearly so it could be recorded and remembered. When he finished, he folded the paper and placed it at the base of the memorial. "Some promises you kept forever." Hans died in 1991, 48 years after Stalingrad. His obituary in the newspaper was brief. Lieutenant Hans Albrecht, 267th Infantry Regiment, author of Letters from Stalingrad, survived the battle and spent his life ensuring others wouldn't be forgotten. His children found his papers after he died. Thousands of pages of testimony and letters and notes. Among them was one final letter written to no one and everyone dated January 1990. To whoever reads this, I was there. I saw what happened when pride and ambition and ideology met reality. I watched good men become ghosts. I survived when 91 others didn't, and I've spent my life trying to justify that survival by bearing witness. This is what I learned. War destroys everything it touches. Not just bodies, but souls. Not just cities, but the idea of civilization itself. The only victory is in remembering. The only honor is in refusing to let silence erase truth. If you want to honor the dead, don't build monuments. Tell their stories. Speak their names. Make sure their suffering meant something by ensuring it never happens again. That's all I have. That's all any of us have. Memory as resistance. Truth as redemption. Love as the final answer to hate. The letter was published in his final book, released posthumously. It became required reading in German schools. Students would read Hans's words and see the photograph of his company and understand in a way no history textbook could convey what war actually meant. They built Stalingrad as a monument to conquest and ideology. But it's remembered as a testament to human endurance and the cost of hubris. The frozen city that was supposed to break the Soviet Union instead broke the Wehrmacht. The battle that was supposed to win a war instead revealed war's essential futility. And in the end, the only victors were those who survived to tell the truth, who carried letters home through years of captivity, who spoke names until names became more than entries in casualty lists, who transformed suffering into testimony and testimony into warning. They marched into Stalingrad singing songs of certainty. They emerged as ghosts, carrying evidence that certainty is the first casualty of truth. The letters they wrote in frozen basements outlived the empire they fought for. The names they whispered in darkness echo louder than any propaganda. The promises they made to remember survived when everything else turned to ash. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share their story. Write a name in the comments below. Keep them alive in the only way that matters now. Through memory, through witness, through refusing to let silence claim the final victory. Because in the end, they didn't die for nothing if we remember why they died and choose differently. That's the only redemption history offers, the only honor the dead can claim. The only way forward through the ruins of what we've built with hate is to remember it all with love.